The rain had started suddenly, as if the sky itself had grown tired of holding things in, and I stood under the dim yellow streetlight outside her apartment building, jacket soaked, shoes heavy with water, telling myself I would knock once and leave if she didn't answer, because that would be easier than reopening a door we had both closed years ago. But when the door finally opened and Clara stood there, barefoot on the cold tile floor, wrapped in an old grey sweater that hung off one shoulder, time folded in on itself. And for a second I wasn't a man standing in the present, but a memory she hadn't fully escaped. Her eyes searched my face as if confirming I was real, and she stepped aside without saying a word, letting me in not with permission but with acceptance, the kind that doesn't need explanation. And inside her apartment, everything felt unchanged, yet unfamiliar. Like a song you remember but can't quite sing along to anymore. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of tea leaves, the bookshelf still leaning slightly to the left, like it always had. And we talked at first the way people do when they're afraid of the truth, about small things that didn't matter, about work and weather and the city, carefully avoiding the sharp edges of the past. Yet every pause carried weight, every glance lingered a fraction too long, and when she poured tea for both of us, her hands trembled just enough to betray her calm. And I noticed because I had always noticed things about her, even when I pretended not to. And hours passed, unnoticed until the rain softened outside, and the city fell into that quiet that only comes after midnight. And she stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out as if searching for an answer written somewhere in the darkness. And then she turned to me and asked almost casually, "Do you want to stay here tonight?" And the question wasn't about shelter or convenience. It was about history, about unfinished sentences and unspoken apologies, about whether we were brave enough to exist in the same space again without pretending we were strangers. And I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because humor was easier than honesty. And I said, "I'm not sleeping on the sofa," half joke, half boundary, half admission that if I stayed, I wouldn't be pretending anymore. And her lips curved into a small smile, not playful, not surprised, just understanding. And she nodded as if she had expected that answer all along. And the rest of the night unfolded slowly, cautiously, like two people relearning each other's gravity, brushing past in the hallway, sharing silence that felt louder than words. And when we finally lay down on opposite sides of the bed, the distance between us felt both enormous and insignificant, and sleep refused to come easily. My mind replaying old conversations, old mistakes, old promises made too early and broken too quietly. And I wondered whether staying the night was a mistake or the first honest thing I'd done in years, because sometimes the hardest place to rest is where you once felt most at home. Morning arrived gently without urgency, sunlight slipping through the curtains and drawing pale lines across the walls. And I woke before she did, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing, realizing how strange and familiar it felt to share silence again. And when she opened her eyes, there was no awkwardness, no rush to explain, just a quiet acknowledgement that we were here because we had chosen to be. And she sat up slowly, pulling the sweater tighter around herself, and asked, "Did you sleep?" And I answered honestly that I hadn't slept much, because some nights are meant for thinking rather than resting. And she nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. And over breakfast, toast slightly burnt, coffee too strong, we finally spoke about the things we had avoided, about why we ended, about how pride and fear can disguise themselves as independence, about how time doesn't heal everything. It just teaches you what you can live with and what you can't. And there were moments of silence that felt heavy but necessary, moments where words failed and truth took their place. And when it was time for me to leave, neither of us pretended it was just another morning. She walked me to the door, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. And for a moment, we just looked at each other, not searching for promises or guarantees, but understanding that whatever came next would be built on honesty instead of memory. And she said quietly, "I'm glad you stayed." Not as a confession, not as a request, but as a fact. And I stepped outside into the daylight, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time, knowing that some nights don't change your life instantly, but they shift something inside you. Something subtle and permanent, and as I walked away, I realized that refusing to sleep on the sofa hadn't been about comfort at all. It had been about refusing to live halfway, about choosing truth over distance, and whatever happened next, at least this time, we had faced each other fully. Days passed after that morning, not with dramatic messages or sudden confessions, but with a quiet pull that neither of us could ignore, the kind that shows up in small, ordinary moments like seeing her favorite tea in a shop window or catching myself typing her name and stopping before hitting send. And when we finally met again, it wasn't planned as something important, just a walk through the park where autumn leaves cracked under our shoes. Yet every step felt deliberate, honest, and unguarded, and we spoke without fear this time, about expectations, about boundaries, about how wanting someone doesn't mean losing yourself. And she admitted she hadn't asked me to stay that night hoping for answers, only for truth. And I told her that leaving that morning hadn't felt like escape, but like preparation. And as the sun dipped low, she reached for my hand without hesitation, not to hold on tightly, but to remind me she was there, present, choosing this moment. And I realized then that love doesn't always return loudly or dramatically. Sometimes it comes back quietly, asking not for promises, but for presence, patience, and the courage to stay awake to what's real. Winter settled in slowly, and with it came a rhythm neither of us rushed to name. Late evenings filled with conversation that didn't circle around fear anymore. Shared silences that felt earned, not awkward. And moments where the past surfaced only to be understood instead of blamed. And there were still doubts. Still nights when distance felt safer than closeness. But we learned to speak before retreating, to listen without preparing an escape. And one evening, as the city lights flickered on and snow brushed softly against the windows, she asked if I was afraid of staying again, and I answered honestly that I was, but that fear no longer felt like a reason to leave. And she smiled, not because the future was certain, but because the present was finally real. And in that quiet understanding, I knew that choosing someone isn't a single decision made in one night. It's a series of small, deliberate stays, repeated even when walking away would be easier.